Hi, this is Jeff Sachs coming to you from Medinat Israel, a very somber and mournful Medinat Israel, for chapter 14 of part 1 of Halakhic Man, sponsored this semester by Michael and Tiffany Beta in memory of Rabbi Ezra Labaton, Zichrono Livracha. We are in the 14th and the 15th chapter of the longer first part of the 2 parts of Halakhic Man. I had really hoped to finish the entirety of part 1 before we go off on break after Tisha B'Av, but it doesn't look like that's meant to be. Although if somehow I can sneak in one more shiur, you'll get an email to let you know about that, but it doesn't seem likely. Having gone through these questions of Halakhic Man's mindset and how he relates to the world around him and the role of emotions in his worldview, Rabbi Soloveitchik is still yet curious to understand what his, given that cognition, given that the degree to which, in many ways, Halakhic Man is more similar to cognitive man. In some ways, he is more similar to the scientist than he is to other members of faith traditions and even other Jewish worldviews, even other religious Jewish worldviews, as epitomized by homo religiosus, by religious man. Given that Halakhic Man, in the last chapter we had to describe, these weren't Rabbi Soloveitchik's words, they were mine, but why Halakhic Man isn't some kind of robot, why he isn't a kind of Jewish halachic Mr. Spock, ruled by cold logic, by rationalism, by cognition, by thought, to the detriment of emotion. And given that we had to explain that, we had to explain it because it's a reasonable question. It has to be addressed. So now, further he asks, is Halakhic Man devoid of the splendor of that raging and tempestuous sacred religious experience that so typifies the ecstatic homo religiosus? Can Halakhic Man attain such peaks of enthusiasm that he will cry out in rapture, Ma gadlu ma'asecha Hashem, kulam b'chochma asita? In other words, Halakhic Man looks at the wonders of nature and he sees Simonim in the Shulchan Aruch. He looks at a bubbling well and he sees the mikvah. He looks at the Grand Canyon and he sees Tel HaMislaket. Well, what about that religious experience? What about David HaMelech? What about Ma gadlu ma'asecha Hashem? How manifold are thy works, O Lord? Is it possible for Halakhic Man to achieve such emotional exaltation that all his thoughts and senses ache and pine for the living God? Well, where is the role for the religious ecstasy? The presumption on the author's part here is that religious ecstasy is an experience that possesses value. So where does that fit into Halakhic Man's life? Halakhic Man is worthy and fit to devote himself to a majestic religious experience in all its uniqueness, with all its delicate shades and hues. However, for him, such a powerful, exalted experience only follows upon cognition. Halakhic Man is capable of experiencing that emotional rapture, but it comes not from a kind of primal experiential experience, but from first through the portal of thought, of cognition, of putting it through that halachic radar that we've spoken about. And any emotion, any experience of rapture that would come through the back door, without that going through the Halakhic Man intellect first, would be very suspect at best and illegitimate at worst. I'm just looking at Arya's comment. So Arya, are you identifying with those motions, that sense of wonder at the universe, through the prism of homo religiosus, or through that of Halakhic Man, which requires a kind of scientific understanding first? Okay, so Arya claims to be a Halakhic Man, as we all should strive for. But since this, and again, this is referring back to much earlier chapters where he describes how Halakhic Man observes the universe through the a priori ideal halakha, which is then reflected in the real world, the kind of difference between the ideal and the real. But since this experience occurs after rigorous criticism and profound penetrating reflection, it is that much more intensive. In other words, it's not just some kind of emotional flash in the pan. It emanates from a very, very deep intellectual experience. It's the grafting of the emotion and the intellect. I described, I think, in passing last week, the week before, what someone had once told me, that the kind of emotional experience that you might have that comes through that eureka breakthrough moment, which is part of the scientific inquiry. To paint the scientist as this emotionless computer is not true, but the emotional experience, the rapture, comes about as a product of the cognitive experience. So I think I described that feeling that I think I mentioned that it was Rabbi J.J. Schechter told me once, that after having worked for many years on a doctoral dissertation on the writing and life of Yaakov Emden, at the end of that experience, when he actually stood at the grave of Yaakov Emden, it was this overpowering emotional experience, but that only came about because of his years of study. In other words, anybody who goes to the grave of Yaakov Emden knows this was a very great rabbi, but without having delved into the teachings of that great figure, it's a different kind of thing. But when you've been wrestling with this historical figure's life and writings and teachings, and then you come in proximity to his final resting place, the emotion wells up, not because you're very close to a historical figure, but because of that energy that you'd invested through the years of study. So what may the matter be compared? To the physicist who concerns himself with mathematical formula, the laws of mechanics, the laws of electromagnetic phenomena, optics, etc. He joins together precept to precept, line to line. In other words, the scientist also feels this, where is it? Here you go. That you study something for a very long time, and then you perform the experiment. I always think of those what do you call it, the engineers and the people that work in mission control in the NASA missions, like when they send this probe up to Mars. You have people that work for years and years on something in the completely theoretical realm, theoretical physicists and engineers and the rocket propulsion people Now, they're not actually flying. They're not like the astronauts of old. They're scientists. Some of them are so absolutely nerdy when you see them on TV, and they're standing there, and there's those moments of radio silence where they're waiting to see did the probe land and did the rover deploy, and then when it works, there's this euphoria. So it's the euphoria of rewarding themselves for a job well done and for hard work and all of that, but it's also that sense that all of the yagia, all of the work, the theoretical work, the science behind it, the calculations and the planning and the designing and the trying to execute it till it all comes together, that's the euphoria. Euphoria isn't just because, like there's always there's always like some guest that's in the room. Like sometimes it's the vice president or something like that because he's officially in charge of NASA or something. So he's also like pumping a fist and excited. But I always imagine there's something fake about that because he wasn't involved in 20 years of research to get this thing up there. Any depiction of any of the NASA missions always tries to capture this. Anne mentions that there's a documentary about the search for the Higgs boson, which I must confess I still don't fully understand, but I understand it's a big deal. And you have people who so I just posted this link to this video from the early 70s of the Apollo 15 mission, where the commander of the mission, his name was David Scott, it goes up onto the moon, and he drops a feather and a hammer to demonstrate in a zero gravity or a near zero gravity environment that Galileo was right. So we always knew that Galileo was right. Galileo also knew that he was right, but it couldn't be demonstrated. It could only be proven theoretically, because on Earth there is gravity. But Galileo said that in the absence of gravity, a feather and a hammer would fall at the same rate to the ground. And on the moon, he demonstrates this. It's a kitschy kind of thing. And he makes this nice little statement that it's partially because of Galileo that we got to the moon. So let's demonstrate, let's do one for Galileo and actually put his thought experiment into practice. Right, correct. I'm sorry. It's not gravity. It's the absence of the atmosphere. Then in a zero gravity field, the absence of the atmosphere, the absence of friction of the air, they would fall at an even rate. That's more correct. But there you are. It's exciting. The theory was there. The physicists had known this, had been working on it, possibly for 500 years or whatever it is, and now we can put it into practice. Yet the ideal numbers, the ideal formula, ideal equations of the mathematician cannot be grasped by one's senses. These numbers that only are meaningful from within the system itself, only meaningful as part of abstract mathematical functions, symbolize the image of existence. Is not the physicist swept to heights of rapture in the act of cognizing the world? Did not Newton delight in the beauty of the world when he discovered the law of gravity? I mean, the Agadah about the apple falling just captures something of that sense of wonder. Whether Newton was actually struck on the head with the apple is irrelevant. What's significant in that story is the kind of sense of wonder, that sense of the eureka moment, the rapture that comes from figuring it out. I've skipped ahead to the top of page 84. From the very midst of the laws, there arise a cosmos more splendid and more beautiful than all the works of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Here, Leonardo da Vinci not as scientist, but as artist. That through science that you can look at. I have a brother I have a brother-in-law rather, I have a brother-in-law who's a PhD in computer science, and he's a programmer, and he's very, very smart. And I remember him once looking in a math book and commenting on how beautiful a certain equation is, which, it takes a mathematician to really understand what that statement could mean. So for the scientist, the beauty of that endeavor is even greater than Michelangelo. It's even greater than the raw encounter with the natural world, with the wonders of the natural world. Perhaps these experiences of cognitive man are lacking in the emotional dynamic and turbulent passion of aesthetic man. Perhaps these experiences are devoid of flashy and externally impressive bursts of ecstasy or sticky enthusiasm, a kind of natural enthusiasm. However, the religious, rapturous experiences of Halakhic man and of the scientist, are possessed of a profound depth and ear-penetrating vision. They do not flourish and then wither away like experiences that are only based upon a vague, obscure moment of psychic upheaval. And because of that, because it's not just a kind of emotional flash in the pan, they're more long-lasting, they're more deep, they're more profound, they're more meaningful. Such an experience is not some fleeting, unstable phenomenon that ebbs and flows, but is fixed and determined, possessed of a clear and firmly established countenance of its own. So it is with Halakhic man. His religious experience is mature and ripe when he cognizes the world through the prism of the halakha. Halakhic man will not dance in the streets on Passover night, nor will he shout out his prayers on the days of war. He's not a Breslover Chassid. But this is not to say that he is not inspired and excited by sacred time, or that he is lacking in a powerful religious experience, even though it's going to express itself in a different way. The Halakhic man who cognizes sacred time, who realizes, for example, that the Day of Atonement carries with it absolution, or who knows the laws of Passover, and specifically the laws of Passover night, that night which imposes upon him additional commandments, song, meaning Hallel, Matzah, Morah, the recitation of the Exodus. You're aware, you get to Leil HaSeder, and you know that this is a unique night, and that with the unique night comes special mitzvot that are with us only for a few hours a year, is not devoid of a mighty and forceful religious experience. Right? In other words, that experience itself is one of great emotional power. Although it's not, for Halakhic man, it's not going to express itself as jumping up and down. This experience is arrived at, to be sure, through contemplative reflection, but it is in no way inferior to the experience of the universal homoreligiosis. Separate, but not unequal. Separate, but not inferior. It's going to look different. It's going to be a different experience. It's not going to be the kind of rapturous enthusiasm that we think of when we think of, like, the religious. When we think of any movie you've ever seen that depicts like a tense revival with faith healing and laying on the hands, and that kind of stereotype of homoreligiosis. That's not Halakhic man's rapture, to be sure. Let me just look over some of these comments. How in the Nevi'im. That's interesting. Arya makes a point about mathematics, even the idea of mathematics predating the world. In other words, the truth of mathematics and the truth of the laws of physics, are such that they are eternal. That even before the physical universe, The laws of physics were in place because they govern what will be or would have been the physical universe. This experience is modest, the experience of homo religiosus. It's not ecstatic. It's modest, retiring, very delicate, but yet strong as flint. In general, we can set it down as a firmly established rule that any religious experience which is based upon an all-encompassing cognition and profound understanding is exceptionally consistent, intensive, and long-lasting. This is his claim that this is his claim that that the emotional experience, the religious experience, the religious ecstasy of Halakhic Man, which has to come through the front door of cognition, is going to be longer lasting and more profound and more intense. Even though on the surface it will look much more placid. At times we may tend to look askance upon that religiosity which follows cognition. For does it not seem somewhat pallid, overly refined, indeed fastidious? However, these characteristics are in truth a highly auspicious song. Don't be led astray because the Halakhic Man seems on the outside to be cool, reserved. That doesn't mean that inside there isn't a profound religious ecstasy. He's arguing against the stereotypes of the cold Litvak, the cold Lithuanian Talmudist. You know, the stereotype of all of the people that he identified as actual Halakhic men. His father, his grandfather, his two grandfathers, his uncle, that these are the great Halakhic men. In fact, the essay ends with a statement that the true Halakhic men are often misunderstood. The true Halakhic men may appear to be emotionless, drab, no internal turmoil. In fact, they really are. But because we mistake the religious ecstasy, the rapturous experiences of homo religiosus, who after all, in the population, far outweigh the population of homo religiosi, is far outweighs that of Halakhic men. So we're much more familiar. We encounter them more. We get on the bus, there they are. All over Yerushalayim. Yeah, I mean, on every street corner they meet a homo religiosus. Halakhic men are harder to come by. So when you meet one, you think, oh, I know what religious ecstasy looks like. I saw it at the Kotel this morning. I saw it at Meron on Lag BaOmer. Halakhic man looks like a computer. I mean, there's no heart there. There's no soul there. So the Rav is arguing against that because we make a mistake in taking what we think is profound religious moment just because it's more garden variety and assume that's what it has to look like across the map of all the religious personalities. Halakhic man does experience religious ecstasy. It just looks different. And we who may not understand it will be led astray into thinking that it doesn't exist. Those old jokes, I mean, there's no end of jokes of jokes and stories and maislach about the Litvak. And again, Halakhic men don't need to be Lithuanian Jews, although in this portrait it happens that they may all in fact be Lithuanian Jews. But in theory, I presume the Rav would admit that it could be that even a yeke could be a halachic man. Even a Moroccan can be a halachic man, although he may have never met any. So there's that story. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's a story about Reb Chaim Brisker or about some other halachic man, but there was an occasion where a halachic man and a homo religiosus are together. And there's a snowy day, as it tended to be in those parts of the world. And the river was frozen over. And the Hasidic Yid, the homo religiosus, starts singing from his soul, and suddenly the sun shines, and the snow melts, and the river flows, and the birds tweet. And then the Litvak looks at his watch and says, it's time to daven mincha. And the world is thrown back into snow and ice. So that's the kind of caricature that the Rav is arguing against here. At times we look askance upon the religiosity which follows cognition. At times we look down at the halachic man because we misunderstand him. Cognition, he makes mention of the famous in Avos about if someone is walking along and he's learning, and he stops learning to say ma na'a ilan zeh, how beautiful is this tree? So it's as if he's committed a mortal sin. So that Mishnah has been interpreted in many different ways. I mean, I presume that the simple under-reading of the Mishnah is the idea that when you're learning, nothing else can impinge on the learning. That to interrupt yourself, to look at the beauty of the world around you, is a very grave matter indeed, because Torah study has to take precedence. That's I presume, the conventional garden variety, the conventional simple reading of the Mishnah. So the Rav says, cognition should precede rapture. In other words, it's a very creative reading of the Mishnah. The problem with stopping and learning and looking at the world for that moment of ecstasy, how beautiful is this tree, ma na'a ilan zeh, is that your appreciation of nature, the ecstatic moment, comes before the cognition has been completed. You've interrupted your learning. Cognition should precede rapture, not the other way around. Because if you just have this rapturous experience without understanding what it is that you're experiencing, it's a very, again, at best, shallow experience, and at worst, potentially dangerous, because we give over ourselves to the kind of power of those emotions without understanding what it is that's exercising itself over us. It's true that it's a drasha on the Mishnah. He's not really explaining the pshat of the Mishnah. He's using it as a hook to make his point about the problem of experience coming before emotion, experience coming before cognition, emotion coming before rationality, as opposed to the emotion that can emanate after rationality. And again, you don't need to study the natural world to have the kind of halakhic man appreciation of it. In other words, the rapture that halakhic man experiences when he looks at that bubbling stream or at that mountainside and valley don't come because he was studying things in geology. It comes because he was studying the dinim of Hilchot Mikvot. Okay, let me just look. Okay. There's some very interesting comments that are being posted by our very learned Chabura tonight. So those of you that are following along in the archives, I recommend that you take a look at them. Cognition should precede rapture. He who reaches a peak of enthusiasm, his study, it is as if, cognition should precede rapture. He who reaches a peak of enthusiasm prior to his having cognized, prior to his having completed his study, it is as if he has committed a mortal sin. The approach to God is also made possible by the halakha, primarily, and not just through nature. Primarily, halakhic man cognizes God via the Torah, via his Torah, God's Torah, via the truth of halakhic cognition. There is truth in the halakha. There is halakhic epistemology. There's halakhic thinking. Chava me'eretz midah. The measure, therefore, is larger than the earth. Pasuk in Iyov. There is a Torah wisdom that is broader than the sea. And all of these are rooted in the will of the Holy One. Blessed be He. Page 86. We require neither miracles nor wonder to prove the existence of God, for the halakha itself bears witness to its creator. To be sure, we can also find in the halakha a practical approach to God, an approach to God through the performance of the commandments in a concrete fashion. But this approach only follows in the wake of the first approach. The primary approach to God is the ideal normative theoretical relationship that prevails between God and the halakhic man, revealed through the Torah. And now there's this given that halakhic man is not one that goes out into the world and experiences the created world in the way of homo religiosus and feels the rapture, but is closer to that of cognitive man, who first does the theory and then the practice, first studies the law and then is interested in seeing how it plays out in practice. This leads us to another point here in the middle of page 86. Halakhic man is not a man of words. Thought and speech, the meditation of the heart and the articulated word, logos qua thought and logos qua speech, constitute an old problem in philosophy. And it has something to do with formulating thought as speech versus thought as thought itself. That thought has to precede speech, although anybody that spends 3 minutes watching cable news knows that it often flows in the other direction. Halakhic man in this respect resembles cognitive man. Just the emotion emanates from thought for cognitive man, but not necessarily for homo religiosus. Homo religiosus experiences the raw emotion and then may try to figure out where that's coming from. Homo religiosus tries to think before he speaks, think before he formulates his words, just like he tries to think, hypothesize for the scientist before experiencing the physical world. Halakhic man, among halachists who typify this characteristic are Rashi, Maimonides, the Gaon of Vilna, Chaim Brisker, all of whom strictly limit themselves in the use of words. This is that kind of manner. I mean, he chooses these 4 archetypical halachists who are very well known for their economy of prose. You know, that idea that there's not an extraneous word in Rashi, that every single word of Rashi is weighed out and chosen with such care that we can spend the next 1,000 years after Rashi wrote them picking them apart and making diukim and trying to extrapolate his meaning based upon every single word and every single letter. That is the mark of the expression of halakhic man. every jot and tittle. All of these halachists strictly limited themselves in their use of words, but soared to the furthest expanses on the wings of thought. Every jot and tittle of Rashi's commentary on the Talmud and Maimonides' Mishnah Torah allude to heaps upon heaps of halachot. The word v'ayin, meaning compare, in the Vilna Gaon's commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, contain treasure houses of thought. Each and every sentence in the writings of Chaim constitute a flowing spring of creative insight and cognition. When ecstasy seizes hold of the homo religiosus, he bursts forth in song and psalm and is very casual with the phrases and linguistic forms he uses. Halakhic Man, on the contrary, is very sparing in his recitation of the piyutim. And here he's trying to explain a family custom where the Briskers did not, going back to the Vilna Gaon, did not recite many piyutim, many of the extra liturgical poems. Many of the things on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that add so much time to the davening were skipped by them. There was a kind of reticence. There was a kind of desire that things should be expressed succinctly. The Rambam's notion, interestingly, the Rav doesn't discuss it here, although he discusses it elsewhere. The Rambam's notion of negative attributes, that we can't describe God, and therefore, since we can't describe God, it's better not to say much. All we can do is say what God is not. God is not corporeal. God is not bound by time. God does not have a hand, does not have a foot, etc. But to say what God is rather difficult, and therefore, it's best not to say anything. Even to praise God, we shouldn't undertake to praise God excessively, but we should limit ourselves to those praises that are found in Tanakh and in which were later formulated or formalized by Chazal, because that kind of excessive run-on of the mouth cheapens words, cheapens thought. Again, Aryeh, who's a mathematician or an aspiring mathematician, is adding a lot of. Aryeh, why don't you post the link to your blog? You write a math blog, and I suspect that some of our conversation tonight is going to end up there at some point, so people can read the I guess the more formulated thoughts. WHY math, that's WHYI, the letter I, MATH, WHYmath.blogspot.com. You'll let us know when this has been condensed into a blog post. So Halakhic Man, shied away from these piyutim, not heaven forbid on account of philosophical qualms, but because he serves his maker with pure halachic thought, not precise cognition and clear logic. He does not waste his time reciting songs and hymns. Aside from, let's say, Hallel, today after all was Rosh Chodesh, aside, let's say, from Hallel, although even I think some of the Briskers did not say Hallel with a bracha on Rosh Chodesh, which is a later minhag. Yes, right, Aryeh, you'll send it to me and then we'll post it on the website. We'll let everybody know about it. The cognition of the Torah, that is the holiest and most exalted type of service. He serves the Creator by uncovering the truth of halakha. He tells the story that once when he was a little kid, on Rosh Hashanah in the afternoon, he's sitting there and reciting Tehillim, which was, after all, a common practice. The Rav grew up in a town full of Chabad Hasidim, simple folk, hardworking, simple folk, wood choppers and shoemakers and water carriers and the like. Good old-fashioned, God-fearing homo religiosus. And the Rav's father was the rabbi in this town of Chaslovich, and once he enters synagogue on Rosh Hashanah late in the afternoon after the davening was over, and he found me reciting Tehillim with the congregation, which was the practice. They would gather. These were people, they wouldn't necessarily dedicate themselves to learning a page of Gemara or a chapter of the Rambam. That's not where they were holding. They would recite the Tehillim. They would recite the Psalms. They were shuls. Near where I grew up, there was a shul whose official name was Chevra Tehillim, right? The Beit Yitzchak Chevra Tehillim, because it was, when it was founded, by the time I was around, it was a shul that had many Talmidei Chachamim in it. But when it was founded 60, 70, 80 years earlier by immigrants, by simple folk, people who were committed to the great sacrifice of what it meant in that part of in the early 20th century in America to be Shomer Torah Mitzvot, but they weren't learned folk, but they were committed to being engaged in Torah. So between Mincha and Mariv, instead of learning the Daf Yomi or learning Mishnayot, they would recite Tehillim. They would sit together around a table, and they would recite that day's portion of Tehillim. So the Rav is there, and he's doing the same. And the Rav's father says to him, if you wish to serve the Creator at this moment, better study Maseches Rosh Hashanah, the laws pertaining to the festival. While the congregation would recite Piyutim on days of awe, Reb Chaim, the Rav's grandfather, would study Torah. In other words, the long davening, all those Piyutim, all those extra liturgical poems that are added in, so Reb Chaim, he would learn Gemara. What do you need to be saying those Piyutim for? The Piyutim are added to the davening, but they're not part of the essential prayer itself. The essential prayer itself, of course, is a mitzvah. But the custom of adding these supplementary piyutim on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, so Reb Chaim thought it was better to sit and learn. On Rosh Hashanah, he would study the laws of Shofar. On Yom Kippur, the laws pertaining to the Avodas Yom Kippurim, the sacrificial order of the day. God Himself sits and studies Torah, according to the Gemara. The study of the Torah is not a means to another end, but is the end point of all desires, is the most fundamental principle of all. And here, a line earlier, he quotes the Gemara in Brachos, She'ein lakadosh baruch hu b'olam hazeh la'arba amot shel halacha. God only has in His world the 4 cubits of the halacha. Right? That God's entire presence in the world is through the halacha. And therefore, someone who just experiences rapture, divorced from that, is missing something, or is experiencing something. I mean, I'm reading between the lines here, but he's either having a kind of facile shortcut to a religious experience, or he's fooling himself into thinking he's having a religious experience, when in fact he's not, because it's devoid of the Arba Amot of Halacha. I think I mentioned to you way back when that the Ish Halacha was originally delivered as a lecture. I mean, there are themes in Ish Halacha which the Rav delivered orally many times in many different ways. But the original iteration of this book, this long essay, was as a talk that the Rav gave at Yeshiva University prior to his arrival as a member of the faculty at Yeshiva University. He was invited to deliver some kind of special lecture, and he delivered the Isha, what became the Ish Halacha. It was delivered in English, although it was subsequently published in Hebrew, and then only many years later translated back into English. But I knew someone, Rabbi Yisrael Shurin, Zichrono Livracha, Zecher Tzedek Livracha, who lived here in Efrat, who had been a Talmud of the Rav in Boston before the Rav went to YU, and who was present at that first recitation of the talk, which became Halakhic Man. And he said at this section, when he talks about how God has only the Arba Amot of Halacha, the 4 cubits of the Halacha, and that's all there is in the world, the study of Torah is not a means to another end, but the end point of all desires, the most fundamental principle of all, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself sits and studies Torah. He said when the Rav said these lines, he cried. Now there's a discussion of Torah Lishma, the study of Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake, primarily refers to study for the sake of the love of Torah, that one should exert oneself to determine the root principle of the law. But a person may think that Lishma, Torah for its own sake, means for the sake of God, for the sake of cleaving to God. That we learn Torah, we become drawn closer to God. And since all God has is, since the pathway to understand God is through cognition, through the Torah, and not through looking at a shooting star for the Halakhic Man, therefore, according to this opinion, it would be preferable for one to occupy himself with songs and hymns, and in particular with the Psalms of David, the sweet singer of Israel, because those things arouse in one love for God and a sense of his closeness. And this is sufficient for him, and in the manner he will attain a pleasant life. So the Rav doesn't deny that there are other paths to God. And for homo religiosis, that might be it. The Tehillim might be a better avenue or a more effective avenue for the homo religiosis than the Daf Gemara. But don't think that. That is not the case. For the Midrash at the beginning of the Midrash Tehillim says that King David requested that God should count one who would recite the Psalms as being on the same level as one who studied the laws of leprosy and tense, somebody who studies halakha, specific. I mean, these are just examples of halachot. This clearly implies that the study of these laws is of more value than the recitation of Psalms. The request that David HaMelech makes, that reciting the Tehillim, reciting the Psalms, should be as if you're learning a page of Gemara, is proof of the fact that reciting the Psalms is in fact not the same thing, not on the same level as learning a Daf Gemara, and in fact, the Midrash does not indicate that God granted him this request. No, and as David HaMelech doesn't think so. David HaMelech thinks it should be, but if it was, he wouldn't have needed to ask for it. Right? He was asking that the recitation of Tehillim be elevated above its religious meaning. And the Rav, again, this is the Rav's reading of the Midrash, is implicitly that if you have to ask for that elevation, for that getting bumped up, it's indicative of the fact that it doesn't start off on that plane. And since the Midrash doesn't mention that God actually granted that request, presumably it remains on a lower plane. This is so because the primary purpose of study is not simply to study for the sake of cleaving to God, but to comprehend through the Torah the commandments and laws, and to know each and every matter clearly, both in general principles and particulars. Yeah, clearly, this is, in other words, this is one man's Judaism. This is the Rav's depiction of the Halakhic man's worldview. Homo religiosus clearly disagrees. The Rav is very clear that we're describing a certain cut of the population, probably a minority at that, and other religious characters are going to see a different value system or a different ladder of preferences. I'll just skip ahead now towards the end of the chapter. When a person exerts himself to understand any halakhic matter clearly, then it is certain that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests upon him at the very moment he is studying. As Chazal state, God only has in this world the 4 cubits of halakha. Ein lakadosh baruch hu b'olam hazeh ela arba amot shel halakha. The above is the declaration of Reb Chaim Volozhin, the outstanding student of the Gaon of Vilna, and the founder of the Yeshiva of Volozhin. And it would appear to me, says the Rav, that it would need no comment. But that's an understatement, because we've just spent 89 pages essentially commenting on that. We've just spent 89 pages. We just spent 14 chapters, 14 out of the 15 chapters that describe the worldview and life of Halakhic Man, which is the title of this longer section of the work, to a description of what that is, of what Torah study is, of what the life and worldview of the true student, and again, this is the Rav's depiction of what the Halakhic Man is, what the true student of the halakha, and again, halakha as a synonym for what others might call Torah or Judaism, what it is. So that idea of he kind of almost painted us into a corner, because Halakhic Man seems so esoteric isn't the word. It's such an unobtainable, even almost unappealing. When we reach that point at the end of, I think, chapter 12, where Rav Ilya Feinstein is running to put on the Rabbeinu Tam tefillin as his daughter is dying, which is quite shocking to most of us. So now the Rav comes with fists flailing out of the corner that he's painted us into, or painted the Halakhic Man into, to try to describe the inner life of Halakhic Man. We get to that point in the essay, and we presume Halakhic Man is there's nothing. You open up the inside, it's you know, to paraphrase something that was once said about Mr. Spock, his father was a computer and his mother was an encyclopedia. Right? His father was the Halakhic radar, his mother was the Shulchan Aruch. There's no neshama inside, there's no passion inside, there's no emotion inside. Right? So now we come out and show that there is. But it's the emotion that comes through the other end of cognition. And it's going to look different than what we're used to. So don't be fooled into thinking that it's not there, that it doesn't exist. Again, as the Rav will go on to say, Halakhic men are few and far between. People who are careful to do mitzvot, which everyone should do. Homo religiosus, cognitive men, right? A religious scientist should be careful to do mitzvot. That doesn't make him a cognitive man. It doesn't make him a homo religiosus. These are all these kinds of pure, abstract, archetypical characters. But somebody who does mitzvot, somebody who's careful to daven on time, that does not a halachic man make. Although halachic men would also do that. But that's not the definition of the halachic man, someone who keeps the halakha. Although, in order to be a halachic man, presumably, you must keep the halakha. It has to do with how your relationship to the study of halakha affects your whole worldview. I will send out an email. Hopefully, we might try to find a way to finish up these last few pages of the section before we go off on the break. But I'll have to send out an announcement after we look over the schedule. And if not, we'll pick up where we left off when we meet again at the beginning of Chodesh Elul.